In the early days of September 1900, the bustling coastal city of Galveston, Texas, was completely unaware of the devastation that was about to unfold. Known as the Wall Street of the Southwest, Galveston was one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the United States. The city's prime location on Galveston Island along the Gulf of Mexico had made it a hub of trade and commerce, and its population had grown rapidly, reaching nearly 38,000 by 1900. However, this prosperity came with a dangerous sense of complacency. The city had weathered numerous storms in the past, and the residents believed that they would easily survive any future storms. Even Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, famously wrote in an 1891 article that it would be impossible for a hurricane of significant strength to strike the island. But all of that changed on September 8, 1900, when the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall. This storm, later known as the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, would go on to claim the lives of an estimated 8,000 people, with some reports suggesting that the number could be as high as 12,000. The city of Galveston was devastated, with nearly every building suffering damage and thousands of homes destroyed. In a matter of hours, the thriving city was reduced to ruins, and the lives of countless families were forever altered. The 1900 Galveston hurricane wasn't just a local disaster, it was a tragedy of epic proportions that had a profound impact on the entire nation. The storm ended Galveston's golden era as potential investors turned to nearby Houston, fearful of future hurricanes. In the wake of the storm, significant changes were made, including the construction of a seawall to protect the city and the raising of the island itself. This introduction sets the stage for a closer look at how this catastrophic event unfolded, starting with the formation of the storm and the initial signs that something was amiss. In the next part, we'll explore how the hurricane developed and the preparations, or lack thereof, that were made as the storm approached the Texas coast. The 1900 Galveston hurricane began its deadly journey as a tropical storm in the far eastern Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa in late August. At the time, meteorology was still a developing science, and the tools available to track and predict storms were rudimentary at best. Despite these limitations, weather observers noticed the formation of a storm system that appeared to be gaining strength as it moved westward across the warm waters of the Atlantic. By the end of the first week of September, the storm had intensified into a full-fledged hurricane, although its exact path remained uncertain. In those days, the United States Weather Bureau, which later became the National Weather Service, relied heavily on reports from ships at sea and limited land-based observations. Communication between different regions was slow, and information about the storm was often outdated by the time it reached the public. As the hurricane approached the Caribbean, it made its first significant landfall in Cuba on September 6th. The storm caused considerable damage but did not lead to widespread alarm in the United States. Unfortunately, the Cuban meteorologists' warnings about the storm's potential severity were largely dismissed by their American counterparts. The Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. predicted that the storm would veer northeastward and spare the Gulf Coast. They did not realize that the hurricane was about to take a more dangerous course. On September 7th, the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, where it encountered ideal conditions for further intensification. The waters of the Gulf were exceptionally warm, providing the energy needed for the hurricane to strengthen rapidly. By now, it was clear that the storm was heading toward the Texas coast, but the residents of Galveston remained largely unaware of the impending danger. Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, had noticed some concerning signs. The Gulf waters were rising, the wind was picking up, and the barometric pressure was dropping, a clear indication that a powerful storm was approaching. However, like many others, Klein did not believe that a hurricane of great strength could strike Galveston. He assured the public that there was no cause for alarm, even as the signs of an approaching storm became more ominous. By the evening of September 7th, the weather in Galveston had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Heavy rain and strong winds battered the city, but most residents believed it was just another typical Gulf storm. Some even ventured out to the beaches to watch the waves crash against the shore, unaware that within hours those very waves would rise up and engulf their city. As night fell, the storm continued to intensify and the fate of Galveston was sealed. The lack of preparation and the underestimation of the storm's severity would prove to be catastrophic. In the next part, we will delve into the day of the hurricane, when the full force of the storm struck the city, bringing with it unimaginable destruction and loss of life. On the morning of September 8, 1900, the residents of Galveston awoke to a scene that was already foreboding. The winds had grown stronger overnight, whipping through the streets with increasing ferocity. The sky was a heavy, ominous gray, and the usually calm waters of the Gulf had transformed into a raging, turbulent mass. By mid-morning, the situation had become more alarming, as the winds reached hurricane force and the tide began to surge. Despite the growing danger, many in Galveston remained unaware of the severity of the storm that was about to engulf their city. Some who lived in more vulnerable areas near the coast had begun to move to higher ground, or to the homes of friends and family. Others, however, believed the storm would pass without significant incident, as so many storms had before. The lack of an official evacuation order or any clear warning only added to the sense of false security. By midday, the full force of the hurricane had arrived. The winds, now exceeding 100 miles per hour, tore through the city, ripping roofs off houses, toppling trees, and turning loose debris into deadly projectiles. The storm's surge, a massive wall of water pushed ashore by the power of the hurricane, began to inundate the island. Water levels rose rapidly, flooding streets, homes, and businesses. The low-lying areas of Galveston were quickly submerged, and the floodwaters continued to rise with alarming speed. The waves, driven by the relentless winds, battered the seawall-less island with incredible force. Entire neighborhoods were swept away as houses, unable to withstand the surge, collapsed and were carried off by the floodwaters. People who had sought refuge in their homes found themselves trapped by the rising water, with few options for escape. Panic set in as the reality of the situation became clear. This was not just a severe storm, it was a catastrophic hurricane unlike anything Galveston had ever experienced. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The winds continued to strengthen, now reaching their peak at over 130 miles per hour. The storm's surge rose higher, swallowing more of the city and leaving only the tallest buildings and structures above water. Many sought refuge in the few large buildings that remained standing. But even these were not immune to the storm's wrath. The sounds of crashing waves, howling winds, and the destruction of buildings filled the air, creating a terrifying cacophony. The city's communication with the outside world had been cut off, leaving those in Galveston isolated and without any way to call for help. The Weather Bureau had no way of knowing the true extent of the disaster unfolding on the island, and the residents could only rely on their instincts to survive. Some attempted to flee to higher ground, while others clung to whatever they could find, hoping to ride out the storm. By nightfall, the hurricane's fury showed no signs of abating. The floodwaters continued to rise, and the winds, though beginning to taper slightly, were still devastating. The once vibrant city of Galveston was now a scene of utter devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped out, and countless lives were in peril. The destruction was so widespread that it was difficult to comprehend the full scale of the disaster. As the storm finally began to move inland and lose strength, the people of Galveston were left to face the horrifying aftermath. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath of the hurricane, the devastating loss of life, and the heroic efforts of those who survived to help rebuild their shattered city. As the winds finally subsided and the floodwaters began to recede, the true extent of the devastation in Galveston became horrifyingly clear. The city, once a bustling hub of commerce and culture, now lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated, reduced to little more than piles of debris. The elegant mansions that lined the coast, the bustling downtown businesses, and the modest homes of working families were all gone, swallowed by the storm and the sea. Survivors emerged from their makeshift shelters to find a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. Streets were buried under mountains of wreckage, with shattered timbers, broken glass, and twisted metal strewn everywhere. The floodwaters, which had risen as much as 15 feet in some places, had left behind a thick layer of mud and silt, further complicating the already overwhelming task of recovery. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, mud, and decay, and the eerie silence that followed the storm was punctuated only by the sounds of people searching for loved ones and beginning the grim task of collecting the dead. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the hurricane, making it the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Bodies were found everywhere, trapped in the wreckage of their homes, washed up on the shore, or buried under debris. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city's ability to deal with them, and many were buried in mass graves or simply lost to the sea. The survivors, many of whom had lost everything, were left to grieve in the midst of unimaginable destruction. The city's infrastructure was in shambles. The water supply was contaminated by salt water and debris, making it unsafe to drink. The telegraph and telephone lines which had once connected Galveston to the outside world were down, leaving the city isolated and without a means to call for help. The railroad bridges that connected the island to the mainland had been destroyed, cutting off any possibility of bringing in supplies or evacuating the wounded and displaced. In the absence of any formal communication, rumors and fear spread quickly among the survivors, adding to the sense of chaos and despair. Despite the overwhelming devastation, the people of Galveston did not give up. In the days following the hurricane, a massive and heroic recovery effort began. Those who had survived the storm immediately set to work, clearing debris, searching for survivors, and caring for the wounded. Makeshift hospitals were established in the few buildings that remained standing, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and shelter to those who had lost everything. Word of the disaster slowly began to reach the mainland, and help soon arrived. Relief efforts were organized, and supplies began to trickle in by boat, the only means of access to the island. The U.S. Army was dispatched to assist with the recovery, and volunteers from across the country came to Galveston to help with the monumental task of rebuilding. The city's residents, though devastated by their losses, showed remarkable resilience and determination as they began to piece their lives back together. The rebuilding process was slow and fraught with challenges. With so much of the city destroyed, there was a shortage of materials and labor, and the work was often dangerous. Many of the buildings that had survived the storm were damaged beyond repair and had to be demolished, further adding to the sense of loss. But despite these difficulties, the people of Galveston pressed on, driven by a desire to rebuild their city and honor the memory of those who had been lost. In the final part, we will explore how Galveston rose from the ashes of this disaster, the lessons learned from the hurricane, and the lasting impact it had on the city and its people. In the aftermath of the hurricane, Galveston faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a city nearly wiped off the map. The task was daunting, but the people of Galveston were determined to restore their home. The process began with clearing the massive amounts of debris that littered the island. This was no small feat, as the storm had left behind mountains of rubble, tangled with remnants of homes, businesses, and lives that had been lost. Volunteers, military personnel, and the remaining residents worked tirelessly to clear the streets and begin the long process of reconstruction. Now, one of the most significant and ambitious projects undertaken was the raising of the entire city. Engineers proposed elevating Galveston to protect it from future storms, a project that was both unprecedented and monumental in scope. Buildings were jacked up, sometimes as much as 17 feet, and sand and dirt were pumped in to fill the space below. Streets were raised, and a new seawall stretching more than 10 miles was constructed to shield the island from future storm surges. This engineering marvel not only transformed the landscape of Galveston, but also demonstrated the city's resilience and commitment to surviving in a perilous environment. The economic impact of the hurricane was profound. Before the storm, Galveston had been a major port and one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, known for its vibrant culture and booming economy. The hurricane, however, shifted that prosperity to nearby Houston, which emerged as the region's new economic powerhouse. Despite this shift, Galveston remained an important city, continuing to thrive in new ways. Tourism became a significant industry as visitors flocked to see the seawall and the city's ongoing recovery efforts. The storm also had a lasting impact on disaster preparedness and response. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane is often cited as a pivotal moment in the development of modern meteorology and emergency management. The scale of the disaster highlighted the need for better forecasting, communication, and evacuation planning. Lessons learned from Galveston influenced policies and procedures that would be implemented in future disasters, helping to save countless lives in the years to come. Galveston's recovery was not just about rebuilding structures, it was about healing a community that had been deeply scarred by tragedy. The loss of thousands of lives left a permanent mark on the city's collective memory, and the stories of those who perished became a part of Galveston's history. Memorials were erected and annual commemorations were held to honor the victims and to remind future generations of the city's resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Today, Galveston stands as a testament to the strength and determination of its people. The city has evolved, but it has never forgotten the lessons of the past. The seawall, the raised buildings, and the memorials are enduring symbols of the city's commitment to protecting its future while honoring its history. Galveston's story is one of survival, resilience, and rebirth, a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming disaster, a community can rise again, stronger and more determined than ever. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, but it also serves as a story of hope and recovery. Galveston's ability to rebuild and adapt has inspired countless others, proving that even the most devastating tragedies can lead to renewal and growth. The city's legacy continues to live on, not only in the physical structures that were rebuilt, but also in the spirit of its people, who faced one of nature's fiercest storms and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and resilience. Hurricane Fifi was a devastating natural disaster that hit Central America, especially Honduras, in September 1974. It originated as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa on September 8th, slowly developing as it moved across the Atlantic Ocean. By September 14th, it had turned into a tropical depression near Haiti. Over the next few days, Fifi gained strength, eventually becoming a powerful hurricane. This storm struck several countries along its path, but Honduras experienced the worst of its destruction. When Fifi made landfall on September 18th, it brought with it massive rainfall, intense winds, and severe flooding. Honduras was unprepared for the level of devastation it caused. Entire towns and villages were swept away, and the storm's impact on the country was catastrophic. In total, Fifi claimed the lives of thousands of people and left tens of thousands homeless. It stands as one of the deadliest hurricanes in history, a tragedy that forever changed the regions it affected. Hurricane Fifi's formation began as a tropical wave that emerged off the coast of West Africa on September 8, 1974. As this system traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, conditions allowed it to gradually intensify. By September 14th, it had developed into a tropical depression near the Caribbean, just east of Haiti. Warm ocean temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions contributed to its rapid growth, transforming it into a tropical storm within a day. By September 16th, Fifi reached hurricane strength as it moved through the Caribbean Sea. Early warnings were issued, but many of the areas in its path, especially in Central America, had limited resources for proper preparation. Fifi brought strong winds and heavy rain as it swept over the northern coast of Honduras and other neighboring countries, although it didn't directly hit larger nations like Cuba or the Dominican Republic. The storm caused flooding and minor damage in these regions. Despite its early stages being somewhat less destructive than anticipated, the true impact of Hurricane Fifi became evident as it approached Central America. The combination of its increasing strength and the region's mountainous terrain meant that the storm's rains would soon lead to catastrophic flooding. With the storm gaining momentum, people in Honduras, Guatemala, and other nearby countries began to brace for what was coming. As Hurricane Fifi made landfall in Honduras on September 18, 1974, its true devastation began to unfold. The storm slammed into the northern coast of the country, unleashing torrential rains, powerful winds, and destructive storm surges. Coastal towns and villages were the first to be hit, with homes and infrastructure completely destroyed by the hurricane's intensity. Winds reached up to 110 km/h, tearing apart buildings and uprooting trees as the storm continued inland. However, it was the catastrophic flooding that caused the most widespread damage. The mountainous terrain of Honduras and neighboring Guatemala amplified the storm's effects as the heavy rains turned rivers into torrents, triggering landslides and flash floods. Entire villages were submerged, and many people were caught off guard by the speed at which the water levels rose. Roads, bridges, and communication lines were washed away, leaving communities completely isolated. In the wake of the storm, thousands of people were left homeless, and the death toll began to rise as rescue efforts were hindered by the destruction. Rivers overflowed, and fertile farmlands were wiped out, threatening food supplies in the already impoverished region. While Honduras bore the brunt of Fifi's wrath, other Central American countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Belize also suffered severe flooding and damage. In the aftermath of Hurricane Fifi, the scale of devastation became even more apparent. Entire communities were wiped out, and the death toll soared, with estimates suggesting that up to 8,000 people lost their lives. Thousands more were missing or injured, and the number of displaced families was staggering. With homes, infrastructure, and farmland destroyed, the region faced an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Efforts to provide aid were slow and complicated by the destruction of roads and communication networks. Helicopters and boats were used to reach isolated villages, delivering food, water, and medical supplies. International aid poured in, with countries and organizations offering support in the form of financial donations, medical teams, and emergency supplies. However, the scale of the disaster overwhelmed local and international efforts as the region struggled to cope with the immediate needs of survivors. The economic impact was equally severe. Agriculture, a vital part of the economy in Honduras and neighboring countries, was decimated by the floods. Crops were washed away, livestock drowned, and entire plantations were ruined, threatening food security for months to come. The cost of rebuilding homes, roads, and other infrastructure was astronomical, setting the region back by years in terms of development. The people of Honduras and other affected areas were left to grapple with the long-term consequences of Fifi as the rebuilding process began slowly and the emotional toll of the disaster weighed heavily on the survivors. Hurricane Fifi left a profound mark on Honduras and the surrounding region, with its devastating aftermath affecting the area for years to come. The storm highlighted the vulnerabilities of countries with limited infrastructure and resources to handle such natural disasters. Though international aid played a crucial role in the initial recovery efforts, the long-term rebuilding process was slow and challenging. Many survivors were left to rebuild their lives with little support, and entire communities had to be relocated to safer areas due to the extensive damage. In the years following the hurricane, steps were taken to improve disaster preparedness in Central America. Governments in the region began to focus more on creating better warning systems, strengthening infrastructure, and developing disaster response plans to prevent such widespread devastation in the future. However, the economic and social recovery was slow, with many families continuing to feel the ripple effects of Fifi's destruction for decades. The legacy of Hurricane Fifi serves as a reminder of the power of nature and the importance of preparedness in the face of such catastrophic events. The storm's lasting impact not only reshaped the physical landscape of Honduras, but also the lives of its people, leaving behind stories of survival, loss, and resilience. Today, we'll take you through the story of one of the most devastating hurricanes in U.S. history. Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast in late August 2005, causing widespread destruction, especially in New Orleans and its surrounding areas. This powerful Category 5 hurricane resulted in 392 deaths and caused damages estimated at $186.3 billion. Hurricane Katrina was the 12th tropical cyclone, the 5th hurricane, and the 3rd major hurricane of the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. It was also the 4th most intense Atlantic hurricane to make landfall in the contiguous United States, measured by barometric pressure. In this 5-part series, we'll dive into the formation of Hurricane Katrina, its impact on various regions, the aftermath, and the long-lasting effects on communities. Let's begin by understanding when and where it happened and the backstory leading up to this catastrophic event. In late August 2005, Hurricane Katrina formed over the Bahamas and made its way toward the Gulf Coast. Initially, it struck Florida as a Category 1 hurricane, causing some damage before it entered the Gulf of Mexico and rapidly intensified. By the time it made its second landfall in Louisiana and Mississippi on August 29th, it had become a Category 5 hurricane. The storm's most devastating effects were felt in New Orleans, where the failure of the levee system led to catastrophic flooding. Hurricane Katrina began as a tropical wave that moved off the coast of Africa and traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. On August 23, 2005, this wave merged with the remnants of Tropical Depression 10, forming a new tropical depression about 200 miles southeast of Nassau in the Bahamas. Over the next day, this depression gained strength and was designated Tropical Storm Katrina. As Tropical Storm Katrina moved northwest, it passed through the Bahamas on August 24th and 25th. The storm then turned westward towards Florida. On August 25th, just before making landfall between Miami and Fort Lauderdale, Katrina strengthened into a Category 1 hurricane. With winds reaching up to 74 to 95 miles per hour, the storm caused significant rain and wind damage as it crossed southern Florida, leaving thousands without power. Once Katrina entered the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico on August 26th, it began to rapidly intensify. The storm's power grew quickly, reaching Category 3 status on August 27th. By the next day, August 28th, Katrina had become a formidable Category 5 hurricane with winds exceeding 170 miles per hour and a central pressure of 902 millibars. This made it one of the most powerful Atlantic storms on record. As the storm approached the Gulf Coast, warnings were issued and preparations began. Evacuations were ordered in low-lying areas, especially in New Orleans, where the risk of flooding was high due to the city's below sea level elevation and complex system of levees. Despite the warnings, not everyone was able to evacuate, and many residents remained in the path of the storm. In the next part, we will cover the landfall of Hurricane Katrina, the places it struck, and the immense destruction it caused. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the events of this historic hurricane. On the morning of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made its first landfall as a Category 3 hurricane in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, about 45 miles southeast of New Orleans. The storm brought with it powerful winds of up to 125 miles per hour, and a massive storm surge that would soon overwhelm the levees protecting the city. Katrina's path took it northeastward, and it made a second landfall later that morning near the Mississippi-Louisiana border. The storm surge, which reached heights of over 26 feet, in some areas slammed into the coastal cities of Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, causing unprecedented destruction. Homes and buildings were obliterated, and the beachfront was left unrecognizable. In New Orleans, initial reports suggested that the city had avoided a direct hit. However, the true scale of the disaster became evident as the day progressed. The levee system, designed to protect the city from flooding, failed in multiple locations. The Industrial Canal, the 17th Street Canal, and the London Avenue Canal were all breached, allowing water from Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Borgne to pour into the city. By the afternoon of August 29th, approximately 20% of New Orleans was underwater. The flooding continued to worsen, and by the following day, nearly 80% of the city was submerged. Tens of thousands of residents who had not evacuated found themselves trapped with no access to food, water, or medical care. The New Orleans Superdome, which had been designated as a shelter of last resort, became a grim refuge for those who sought safety there. As the storm moved inland, it weakened but continued to cause significant damage. Katrina's remnants brought heavy rains and strong winds to Mississippi, Alabama, and even parts of Tennessee. Tornadoes spawned by the storm added to the destruction, uprooting trees and damaging buildings. The days following the landfall were marked by chaos and desperation. In New Orleans, the floodwaters rendered transportation and communication nearly impossible. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and the city descended into turmoil. Looting and violence erupted as people struggled to survive in the sweltering heat without basic necessities. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the extent of the destruction, and the long-term impact on the affected communities. Stay tuned as we continue to tell the story of one of the most devastating natural disasters in U.S. history. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina left a stark and haunting reality in its wake. The scale of destruction was immense and unprecedented. In New Orleans, the floodwaters that had inundated the city wreaked havoc on homes, businesses, and infrastructure. Nearly 80% of the city was underwater, with many areas submerged under several feet of water for weeks. The floodwaters, combined with the intense winds, destroyed entire neighborhoods, leaving behind a landscape of devastation. Beyond New Orleans to the Gulf Coast, where the cities of Gulfport and Biloxi in Mississippi faced catastrophic damage. The storm surge here reached heights of up to 28 feet, which was the highest recorded during Katrina. Coastal resorts, homes, and businesses were obliterated. In these areas, the storm surge and accompanying waves combined to leave virtually no structures standing along the beachfront. The impact on the residents was equally devastating. Many who had survived the initial impact of the storm found themselves grappling with a new crisis: a severe shortage of food, water, and medical supplies. The floodwaters had rendered roads impassable and cut off access to many of the city's vital resources. The situation was exacerbated by the sweltering heat and lack of sanitation, which created health hazards and led to a public health emergency. The chaos in the city was compounded by a breakdown in communication and emergency services. With local agencies and facilities submerged and inoperative, the response from first responders was severely hampered. Many residents were left stranded in the flooded areas, waiting for rescue efforts that were slow to materialize due to the scale of the disaster. The response from the federal government and other agencies began to take shape as the days passed. The National Guard, along with local and federal officials, worked to provide aid and begin the process of rebuilding. However, the challenges were immense. The slow and often criticized response to the disaster highlighted significant issues in disaster preparedness and response at all levels of government. In the next part, we'll delve into the long-term consequences of Hurricane Katrina, the efforts to rebuild, and the ongoing impact on the affected communities. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the aftermath of one of the most devastating hurricanes in American history. Hurricane Katrina's legacy is one of profound devastation and enduring change. The storm's aftermath revealed critical flaws in disaster preparedness and response systems, prompting significant reforms and ongoing debates about how to handle such massive emergencies. In the years following Katrina, efforts to rebuild and recover from the disaster were immense. The federal government, along with state and local agencies, launched a massive recovery and reconstruction effort. Funds were allocated to repair and strengthen the levee systems, with the aim of preventing future failures. Infrastructure was rebuilt, homes were repaired or replaced, and communities began to slowly recover from the physical and emotional toll of the storm. The recovery process was long and challenging. Many residents who had fled during the storm faced difficulties returning to their homes, and some never came back. The population of New Orleans, which had been around 450,000 before the storm, saw a significant decline. By 2011, it was down by nearly 30%, and although the population began to rise again, the city had not fully returned to its pre-Katrina numbers. Hurricane Katrina also brought to light issues of social inequality and preparedness. The hardest hit areas were often those with existing vulnerabilities, and the disaster disproportionately affected low-income and minority communities. The slow response and inadequate relief efforts highlighted systemic issues that needed to be addressed to ensure a more equitable recovery process in future disasters. The impact of Hurricane Katrina extended beyond the immediate damage. It reshaped the way Americans view and prepare for hurricanes. The storm spurred changes in emergency management practices, with increased focus on improving communication, evacuation plans, and infrastructure resilience. The experience of Katrina has informed responses to subsequent disasters, with lessons learned about the importance of timely and effective action. Globally, Hurricane Katrina became a symbol of both human suffering and resilience. It prompted a massive outpouring of aid and support from around the world, with many countries offering assistance and donations to help the affected areas. The disaster underscored the interconnectedness of global communities and the importance of solidarity in times of crisis. In conclusion, Hurricane Katrina was a defining moment in American history. It exposed vulnerabilities, sparked changes in disaster management, and highlighted the strength and resilience of the people affected. While the scars of Katrina remain, the recovery and rebuilding efforts have demonstrated the enduring spirit of the communities that faced the storm. The story of Hurricane Katrina is a reminder of the power of nature, the importance of preparedness, and the strength of human determination in the face of adversity.